Hello and welcome to the Rippling Pages podcast. Great writers making waves with the word, all in conversation with me, Liam Bishop. And today I'm joined by Jen Calleja. Jen Calleja is a writer whose writing has been published widely. Her work has appeared in the London Magazine and the Review of Contemporary Fiction, while her translation of the German writer Marianne Poschmann's The Pine Islands saw her shortlisted for the International Man Booker Prize, an award both recognising of the author and the translator. In the last year, she has set up Prosper Press with Kat Starace, promoting emerging and new writers in the Maltese language. And she has also published a book of short stories, I'm Afraid That's All We've Got Time For, published by Prototype Publishing, and Goblins, published by Rough Trade Books. And it's these two books she's here with me to discuss today. Often in your stories, I felt like there was a tension between what is on the surface, the reality of appearances we might call it, but also the reality of a deeper concealed meaning. It's also felt like you were giving the reader a limited amount of time to view and understand that deeper meaning. So I wondered, from where do these stories emerge and what elements compel you to sit down and develop an idea for a story?
Firstly, I really view my stories as stories in that I'm not really interested in replicating reality, I suppose. I really like playing with the fact that anything that is kind of in a written form is not real, and therefore doesn't have to relate completely to what we experience in the kind of shared reality. So for instance, I think that comes out as my stories being quite bare bones. I don't go into a lot of description, like you say. There isn't really a lot of time for the reader maybe to get a grasp often of what is going on, and it can come across as quite strange and disorientating. And I think that comes from, or the reason I write like that is that I start with an obsession that then gets expressed through story. So the story is me exploring a social question or a political question or a personal question that I then perform through text or through a story. And I want it to be as disorientating for the reader as it is for me when I'm in that space. So I'm not trying to offer an answer or kind of safe and complete world. I'm more interested in the reader kind of grasping and grubbing along with me as I'm trying to explore these kinds of very vague, disorientating, dreamlike scenarios, which are my thinking through things.
Yeah, the word that came to me is uncanny at times and dream. And we talk a lot about dreams and dreaming in relation to art. Perhaps too much, but I thought with your stories and the collection, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, is as if a signal towards the limited time we're going to have to understand what's presented to the reader in the stories.
Yeah, completely. And the title is referring to, I think, the briefness of the story. So most of them, I would say, you could describe as being quite short or quite brief. Some of them maybe even on the longer flash to get a bit more specific. But the title is referring to how kind of brief and sometimes shocking that experience is in the stories. I kind of throw some quite jarring things out there, and suddenly it's finished, it's gone. And the title, as I've spoken about before, I think is also referring to. So it almost is also indicating to the reader that these are just quick tales. They're not. They haven't been worked on for years and years and years. They're very brief moments of writing that I've created, and that's not to say then they're not good or they're not the best that I could do. But I really like having a temporal parameter that I'm like, today I will write a story, and maybe it gives them a bit of immediacy, if that makes sense.
I don't know if somewhere did you say that some of these stories come from? They are written quite from a long time ago, or relatively when you were sort of late teens. I don't know if that's right or not.
Like early 20s. Yeah, I think maybe even one of them was published in like the Goldsmith student magazine, I think, when I was still there. I mean, that's when I started writing and publishing, was when I did my undergrad at Goldsmiths.
Right, okay.
Many years ago now. There's a lot of, I think, time is definitely on a lot of people's minds at the moment. And yeah, I graduated from Goldsmiths in 2009, and I'm turning 35 this year. And that just all seems, it's quite bizarre even to think, I've been publishing my creative writing for like 10 years is wild to me, because it still feels like the beginning.
Well, perhaps it's a bit of a tragic irony. Wasn't this book published literally the day that we went into, or the week before lockdown?
Yeah, it was. The launch got cancelled maybe like 48 or 72 hours before, because it was in that very strange week where the conversation went from, oh, this is all a bit strange, and I wonder if we should, cancel that coffee or not go for that drink. And then suddenly, within 24 hours or something, the emails started coming in of, oh, can we cancel that meeting? Or we're actually not going to be in the office anymore. And then mysteriously having to cancel this launch that I'd been waiting for like a year. And I mean, to be honest, it was really quite shocking. I was kind of dazed because I'd been kind of, what's the word? I don't know, building myself up to that. And the book wouldn't even feel real if there wasn't a launch. And in a sense, the book still doesn't really feel real, even though it's coming up to nearly a year now because of that. I've still never seen the book in a bookshop because I haven't been out. So, yeah.
It's really strange, though. I looking at my friend's Twitter, and he tweeted your book today, and it was very odd.
I paid him to make sure he did that.
Very good. Within the book, I noticed a lot of references to bridges in the stories in the collection. Two of the stories, A Town Called Distraction and Apart From When, bridges play a pivotal role in the character's literal journey as well as psychological journey, if we want to call it that.
I think, awareness of what you're writing is a very strange one, because it's often only right at the end or like years later that you realise you have these kinds of focuses on certain things. And I think when this collection was all finished, I realised that I talk about food a lot and I talk about water a lot. And these aren't things that I had picked up on when I was writing it. And then bridges, in A Town Called Distraction, the bridge was kind of a device because the story is about someone running late. And I needed something that would, that it would be devastating if they missed their chance to do something. And often nowadays, if you're running late for something, or if you're late for something, there's no real repercussions. It's very rarely that if you're late for an appointment or you're late meeting a friend, that it's that serious. So the idea in this is that there's a kind of town that's not really in our reality, but it's kind of on an island that has very specific times for when a bridge will lower that you can then make it off to another place. So, it creates real tension because we're aware as the reader that there's only a certain slot that the character has to get in order to make it across the bridge. And yet their behaviour makes them shows that they're not taking it seriously at all, and that they're super distracted by every single aspect of their life. So that was a device. And then another bridge, I think in the final story, is because that story is kind of set in my hometown of Shoreham by Sea. So that's a real bridge, and a lot of the kind of scenery that I describe is directly inspired by Shoreham. But I didn't really notice the bridge connection. The first thing that came to mind was that in one of the bands I play in Sauna Youth, we have a song called The Bridge. So I must have sung about the bridge
Perhaps,
hundreds of times in my life, so maybe that's where it came from.
Perhaps I've read too much into bridges. There is, I mean, I've been reading your poetry as well. There's a poem called Fortress, and there's stuff about kind of castles and these kind of perhaps more fabulistic.
No, completely. I think I'm kind of obsessed. I mean, I talk about it all the time, but I am obsessed with fairy tales and fables, and I think all the imagery and symbolism that comes with it. I mean, there's nothing better than a castle, and the symbolism of that, and in that poem as well of the self being a fortress, and you can lower the bridge or you can keep the bridge up.
Yeah, we're going to talk about a bit more about your fabulism and all that kind of thing. But I was just wondering about literary quartet set during a prize giving ceremony at a literary awards gala. At first, well, to me or to others, it might appear as a kind of parody of the literary scene, but it's not the only story featuring a writer or an artist as a protagonist. So I think the story is more than a meta commentary on writing. It's more elevated than that. And I was wondering across various arts and disciplines that you're involved in, what might you consider the identity of a writer to be in this modern age?
The idea of that story being a kind of parody or a very meta exploration of being a writer, I suppose I was interested in how I could write about the kind of machinations in, say, the publishing industry, and all the things that are going on besides the act of being a writer, without coming across as being really cynical or sounding very bitter. And I think it's just from working behind the scenes in publishing, as an editor or working as a translator and a writer, and having a lot of experience with things like the way writers are marketed, or not even that, but just having this awareness of how you see writers being promoted or talked about. I think I did want to create this kind of parallel space with this prize that really just talked about the elephants in the room for me, of noticing certain privileges given to certain writers. But like I said, I didn't want it to come across as cynical, because that's not very interesting. So I wanted to make sure that the writer has a real conflict about, she kind of resents what she sees as maybe unfair advantage, but also she is complicit in it, and she's trying to figure out where her lines are, because at certain moments you might think, well, is she being a bit hypocritical? And she's also drawing comparisons between something that happened with one of the other characters in the story and another event that happened in her life. So it's also drawing connections between why something feels icky in writing, and how that also links up to other kind of icky things that have happened in her life, specifically, I suppose, as a woman author. So it's really fun. I mean, originally that story was terrible, because it was kind of like, I think originally I made that story as like a secret writer WhatsApp group of all these writers kind of bitching about the publishing industry. And it was just terrible. It was really boring. It wasn't nice to read, and you just didn't like any of those characters. So I'm much happier, obviously, with the way Literary Quartet came out.
Mind if I ask what icky might mean in this to you, or to the character in the story?
Well, I suppose she. I mean, there's something, I don't want to really give it away, but there's it transpires in the story that she has had past dealings with one of the judges of this prize, and it makes this experience she had with this judge reminds her of an unpleasant experience that had happened earlier that day, and she draws connections between the behaviour. So it's kind of like drawing the parallels of, say, in this instance, kind of sexism or misogyny across the different areas of her life and making those connections. So it's kind of like these aren't isolated experiences that happen in certain realms of your life, say in writing or or in your job, that it's something that permeates the whole of society, and it's all connected, and that it all comes out in different ways within institutions. Yeah, so I think that's what I mean by icky. But then also icky also meaning that, say publishing is part of an industry, that it's often romanticized, but there are structures and there's hierarchies and there's kind of institutional powers at play. So things that on the surface seem very natural, there's often a lot of money behind them. So things like reviewing culture or promotion, or the way books are hyped, or the placement of books, the way authors are presented in author portraits, or where they get interviewed and things like this. I think to the outsider, these things seem as a matter of course, but obviously if you have any awareness or experience within the publishing industry, you know that often these things are constructed. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about the other kind of artists and writers that are at play in the story collection. Sometimes people say, oh, writers shouldn't write about writing, or writers shouldn't write about writers. And I think kind of why? I mean, it's like any other subject. It's like I'm interested in the what's behind things and why people behave the way they do, and things like this. So it's the same in the other stories where writers appear. It's kind of like they're obsessed with their own myth, and they're obsessed with their own place within a wider industry. So that, say, the writer in the final story, they've kind of alienated themselves from their hometown because they think that now that they live in a city and they've become a writer, they're above everything, which has just caused them sadness and pain. And then the artists in one of the other stories, Due Process, which is about two sister artists, that is also about feeling conflicted about playing up to an industry and being a creative person within an industry, because you're not creating within a bubble if it's something that you want to pursue, say, as a career, basically.
Yeah, and the two artists in that story, they go their separate ways, but it's very embedded within one person's consciousness. And I guess the early theme of these interviews that we've done is it's definitely not about a behind the scenes of the publishing industry, but it's certainly about the rooms that we write in and about how we find that space and the kind of things we do have to negotiate. It's still a story about theme that I think you're trying to sort of explore, of a constructed reality that might be sort of sometimes cohering with one person's sort of mind of that, but also sort of rubbing against and dissonant with kind of expectations.
Week 23. I went out hunting again today after a fortnight of misses. I've had intense encounters. I won't lay them all out here, it would take too long to explain, and I've gone over them all with Reza in detail already. This balance between attraction and disgust has been especially challenging. Just when I believe I'm ready to give myself up to one of these men, to seal the deal on a better and more secure life for my family, I leave in a hurry or I have to go throw up. I even puked over a Gary I met at Ye Old Cheshire Cheese. I felt so tired today I sat in grind on Threadneedle Street and waited like a spider in a web. I made sure I was facing the door so I could see my prey, and so it could see me. Around 11:30, an older man in a grey suit, white shirt, no tie, brown brogues, no socks, smooth back, shoulder-length grey hair, came in holding the handle of a black leather satchel. He surveyed me with a look of surprise, cocking his head to one side as if he recognised me, then looked down, clearing his throat, and approached the counter to order. I was sitting on the only table, high, small and circular, surrounded by two high stools with grey cushioned seats and low backs. It was a struggle to climb up onto one when I got there around 8. When I was nursing my cold fresh mint tea and pointing at my out-of-focus eyes at the white neon sign on the wall behind the counter that read, "Can't buy me love," The man brought over his black coffee, sat opposite me and drew out his laptop to work. I didn't want to waste my time on someone who wasn't rich, and was about to move to the bar positioned at the window when I noticed the scent he was wearing made my mouth water. It was citrusy but heavy with sandalwood. It had to be expensive. And I don't know anything about watches, but his looked completely unique, personalised. If I looked closely enough, I could see the watch face was a scene of a man with a child over his knee, and with every strike of the second hand his arm would sharply tick to spank the child's backside, while the child's arms and legs twitched. The fabric of his tailored suit was an almost imperceptible mesh of a variety of colours, perfectly attuned to that silver grey, like a faultlessly balanced plate of food.
It did just make me wonder, actually, what are our rewards from, what's your rewards from this book? Besides, money, there will be some kind of monetary reward. This can vary for writers across the board, but I don't know if you can answer.
Yeah, I think in terms of money, publishing with small independent publishers, I've talked about this before, that the financial side is pretty low because that's the reality of kind of small independent publishing, but the actual gains are massive. Getting to work with Jess Chandler at Prototype for both Serious Justice, the poetry collection, and I'm Afraid That's All We've Got Time For, has just been amazing. I mean, she really sets the bar for me for how I want an editor-writer process to be. She's so enthusiastic and professional and supportive, and the editing process was really wonderful, and I felt really cared for as a writer. And we've talked a lot this year in the process of the book coming out, and she's just been amazing. So I think there's a payoff, because it's very different from, say, working with a large publisher where there's a lot of pressure on you to not only create perhaps a more specific and refined kind of book, but also that it will sell a lot, and that also, working with a bigger publisher, they might have a lot more authors that they're working with. So that's what I get from it. And I creating this book was incredibly affirming, having written for so long. To then have a collection of short stories come out was, I don't know, I suppose it proved to me that I should keep writing and I should keep trying. And that's been very difficult this year, especially when there was no launch, etc., where there were moments where I was thinking, is there going to be a future in writing? Is there a future in publishing and creating more books? But then I've come full circle again now, a year on, where I feel very positive about writing, and I feel positive about this book having come out. So yeah.
Well, I'm pleased to hear it, and I'm sure listeners are as well. But it's worth saying as well that this it's a very it's a lovely edition that has been published. The book itself, they are very nice editions that Prototype produce, and as do a lot of other independent publishers as well. Well, let's go on to the other book that you published last year, Goblins. Now, it's a wonderfully short, but it's a discursive and expansive book. I think it's 40 pages, like sub 50 pages. But I absolutely love this book. I love short stories, of course, too. But there's something about Goblins that you wrote in collaboration with Rachel Louise Hodgson, the artist. I just wondered if you could give us a bit more about Goblins and what might have inspired you to write that.
Yeah, so I think what's amazing is the Rough Trade books pamphlet series. Again, I really like having parameters. So in this case, it wasn't so much time, although that did play something in, that was kind of part of it, but the idea that you only have this very small amount of pages, and you can't, it can't be double, it can't even be a few pages more, it has to be quite specific in the parameters of how big it can be, was really freeing. And I think these are things that I've just wanted to write about for a really long time, but couldn't really see a connection between them. And then I think it all just came about that I just kept describing things as goblins, and I wondered why I was making this kind of definition. So I had to create my own definition. I think everyone, when they're a child or in their teens, you kind of make up words for things. And I found myself using this word a lot. And then suddenly, after thinking about all these things for a very long time, the connections formed, and I could see where they all linked up together. And in terms of Rachel Louise Hodgson, I was just a real fan of her work. I was following her on Instagram, and she makes these really gross, really joyful, sometimes quite violent pictures. And it was almost like she was creating work that absolutely matched up to what Goblins was. So I'd already started writing it, and Nina at Rough Trade said, can you think of any illustrators or artists that could provide work for the pamphlet? And I didn't want it to be just anything, and I was thinking about commissioning someone, but then I came across these pictures, and instantly it had everything. It had puppets that she'd made. She had work. It reminds me of Paola Rego, who features in the pamphlet as well. Yeah, so it seemed like a match made in heaven, and I kind of fangirled, and I emailed her and I said, could you possibly think or consider having your amazing art in my stupid little pamphlet about my silly little life? And she was so enthusiastic about it. So I'm still kind of overwhelmed that she let me use her work, and she liked the writing and what I'd written, and that meant a lot as well.
Well, yeah, you've talked about in a Brixton review of books, which you write a column for, one of the sentences I plucked out from your recent piece about Murakami. Every book, every creative act is always a collaboration. And now that's more explicitly here. You've talked about getting in contact with Rachel Louise Hodgson. But I wondered, for all the kind of disciplines that you work in, the art, all the kind of different involvements you have, short stories, translation, I think you're writing a novel, you're doing PhD, musician. Do you have to find some way to sort of collaborate with yourself in this? Is there a process of collaboration with yourself, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's a whole mindset, I think, thinking collaboratively about everything. Collaboration is the link to everything that I do. It's collaboration and communication. And I like this idea of, collaborating with the self. I think I'm used to, as a writer and a translator, and also I suppose playing in a band, is constantly carrying the different ways of seeing something from every single angle, and being open to not wanting to control something, but being really open to other views and other opinions, be it like making music in a band, or as a translator, not making assumptions about what something means, but looking at a sentence or a word from every single angle and trying to think what every single different person might possibly interpret in that sentence. So yeah, I think in terms of collaborating with the self, it's maybe constantly obsessively questioning everything that you write and thinking, well, how is someone going to read that? And is it going to come across the way I want it to come across? And that takes time. And not to assume that because I get what I've written, or I get the image being that I'm trying to write, that everyone else will. So yeah, I think that's where it comes down to. It comes to not jumping to conclusions about anything.
And you don't give conclusions. You don't allow conclusions really to. Well, from my reading, I couldn't come to a conclusion of what had really happened here. There wasn't a given. There was nothing sort of given. I don't know if that's sort of questioning with yourself. I'm sure it must be a really nutritional process for creating. Because some writers get very bogged down by what's, is this going to work and that. But either way, it's very conducive to what you do ultimately create. And you talked about you've mentioned being a musician, and that's, you do talk about you called it your silly little life, Jen, but I don't think I think you're being a bit hard on yourself there, but
I am. Yeah, I'm only joking.
Good. But this idea of goblins is it's fluid, because you refer to yourself as a goblin sometimes, or your child version of as a goblin. But then you also talk about some interactions you've had whilst touring as a musician, and some pretty kind of very unpleasant and not pleasant interactions with people. But I wondered, how does this idea of goblins manifest within your life, and how was it putting that on the page?
Yeah, so I think the main principle of the interpretation of a goblin is that it can be someone good and it can be something good to be a goblin, but it can also be something bad or someone bad. And the thing that links them is it's almost like we don't have the words for it, but it's a selfishness and also a presence. So it really depends on who is being the goblin and why they're being the goblin. So, for instance, if it's somebody who is throwing their weight around to try and control other people, or to harass other people, or to use their power in some way to get their own ends, that is obviously a bad goblin. But then you can also be, in the pamphlet, I'm charting my goal of wanting to become a goblin, and my personal interpretation of becoming a goblin is to be a fearless performer, to feel in control of a space. I think everyone has maybe their personal goblin goals of, when it's kind of like, maybe it's the ultimate form of self. What would it take for you to feel successful, and do you have to let go of a bit of fear, or do you have to feel you feel happy with the way you appear or the way that you feel in yourself? So it's got many different interpretations. There's not one way of defining it, but it comes down to feeling, I suppose, satisfied with yourself in a way, and feeling in control.
Goblin goals.
Goblin goals.
Goblin goals. Fantastic. Well, in Goblins, you talk a lot about the films you watched as a child, Labyrinth, Return Towards. Talk about the terror they gave you, and imagine they gave a lot of other children as well. These child's films, and I'm talking, in inverted commas there, from the 80s, but not to mention some adults that they terrify as well. And admission here, I never watched Labyrinth until this week, so I watched it in preparation, and it's it's the most bizarre thing I've ever watched.
I like hearing about people that have only watched it now, because I kind of wish I could have that experience of being an adult and watching that for the first time.
Yeah, I don't know if ever as a kid or if I was an adult, I don't know if I would have felt even more freaked out I think I'm more freaked out as an adult, I think, so projecting back. But I didn't expect Bowie to be like a bad guy either, I don't think. Mm-hmm. And he's incredibly sort of tights, and costume design was a bit of a budget there, I think, wasn't there? Yeah. Anyway, I do digress. But I get this sense of terror that is something that you're trying to recreate or understand, perhaps, in the book. And I'm thinking back to that quote about all books are a collaborative act. Mm-hmm. Can a book help us, or can the act of writing help us translate experiences which might not have always been accessible to us?
Yeah, completely. I think there is some pushback sometimes around this idea of, for instance, assuming that writers are exploring their own lives in their, say, fiction and poetry. But I think it was nice the other day reading an interview with Megan Nolan, where she says, well, actually, for my work, or the novel she's just bringing out, that's a completely legitimate thing to say, because it is based on experience. And I think a lot of the poetry collection, and then obviously with Goblins, which is kind of memoir, essay, and then with I'm Afraid That's All We've Got Time For, a lot of it is me working through a lot of things that have happened in my life, and that kind of makes sense for me. Not all of it, but a lot of it. In Serious Justice, it's looking at quite a lot of kind of childhood trauma, and there's a fine line, isn't there, between just kind of describing events and was me writing it purely just for me to work out some things, or was it me trying to communicate and share it so that other people can be part of that experience and to think back about their own experiences it's a really tricky one, and sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. But writing Goblins was incredibly cathartic. It was amazing getting some of that stuff down that I'd kept very secret because of this thing of shame. And then part of being a goblin is that you have no shame. So even writing the pamphlet is me saying, well, I'm a goblin, I'm going to talk about all these things that I couldn't tell people, really shocking things for some people, kind of like these encounters with older men and having a miscarriage. And it's things that I literally just could never talk about because I felt like I would be judged. So writing it down, it kind of made me want to giggle, because it was like, oh, this is really naughty to say all these things. But then it's like, it's all part of my life, and it's part of me. And what does that mean? Everyone should write their own goblins, I think.
If anyone can get their hands on this book, just do, because it's a really kind of hopeful book, and about embracing parts of ourselves and our histories that we can't always do, and we can't always allow ourselves to do. I don't think, like you said. So yeah, I really hope listeners do pick that up. So in Goblins and in the films that we just mentioned, you express a kind of dissatisfaction in them as well, particularly the morals that they impart, and Sarah's false epiphany from Labyrinth. Now, I just wonder, for people who are picking up your work, people who are trying to write, how important is it that you do impart a different philosophy, or how might we do that without being too kind of clear and obvious?
Well, there's different reasons that people write, and I think not everyone wants to write or should write because they want to put forward a message necessarily, or sometimes the form is the message. That using something, trying different things out for the sake of it, and being playful. There's a place for all kinds of writing, but I think for me personally, I think going back to those ideas of fairy tales or formative stories, I think, for instance, with Labyrinth, imagining that Labyrinth is a fairy tale like any other story that you're kind of brought up with. And I talk about how I didn't really read a lot as a child. It was mainly television. The false epiphany that Sarah has of it's not fair, oh, but that's the way it is. How when you're younger, you do absorb these messages. So in Goblins, I talk about how at the time it felt very right that would be a message of kind of like, oh, just let go, and don't, if things feel like they're getting to you, just don't worry about it, because there's nothing you can do about it. And how now that I'm older and have become more involved in activism and again becoming more serious as a writer, just thinking about imagining that reader, maybe a younger reader, possibly reading one of my stories and thinking, I wonder what could get embedded in their mind that could change their life. And I think it's being quite hopeful about what writing can do, that writing can be revolutionary. And one of the stories, one of the main characters in The Debt Collector, at the beginning of the story, she's reading Leonora Carrington on a bench, and you can assume as the reader, if you wanted to, that reading Leonora Carrington kind of propels her to change her life. And so that's connected to that idea of, maybe we could read something that will spur us on to do something, to be it a good thing or a bad thing, basically. So I think I'm interested in the fable power of my own stories, imagining them as these artifacts that might go out and change the world, and not in a kind of arrogant way, but it's just the way I picture them, that they're just they're stories, and that stories can change us, and that the messages we embed within them could do something incredible. It can create a whole ideology in someone, like with Labyrinth, how for years that became a rallying cry for me and other people as young people. So that's just a line in a film, and it's amazing to think maybe a line in a story could become someone's entire mode of living, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely, yeah. And either way, that line has provided you with, and I think this is important as well, it's not something that just sort of inspires you to do, from a place of goodness. It's inspired you to work against something as well. I think it's not just the way it is, and it's not just the way it is in your stories either. And this kind of sense of reality, it just all comes back to these worlds that you are sort of trying to, or you do construct. It isn't just the way it is. It definitely, presented appearances aren't in life, and obviously in your stories as well. Well, Jen Calleja, and I hope with your next piece of work that you might want to come again and have a chat with us sometime else. But for now, thank you very much, Jen, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
And that's it for today's episode of the Rippling Pages podcast. My thanks again to Jen Calleja for joining me, and of course my thanks to you for listening. Now you can buy Jen's book from Rough Trade Publishing and Prototype Publishing respectively, and join me next time when I'm going to be joined by the Montenegrin writer Ulja Knežević.